Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 1, about theories of government. It is Lesson 11, about classical liberalism. In this lesson, you will learn about Adam Smith and economics, about John Locke's views of the importance of property, about the essential tenets of classical liberalism, and about the great enemy of liberalism. In the previous lessons, we learned about the concept of ideology and discussed how ideologies can be arrayed on a spectrum. Remember, ideology is a framework of ideas about what the world should be like. This determines what one thinks the government should then be doing. We then learned how we label and arrange ideological positions on this spectrum, and that it has its roots in a debate that took place in the French National Assembly of 1789. In the French National Assembly, the radicals, inspired by the teachings of liberal philosophers, wanted to dethrone their king. They sat on the left of the room in which they met. The monarchists, who wanted to conserve the monarchy, in other words, wanted to preserve and protect the position of the king, reacted to the radicals and sat on the right. From this division, we get the modern terminology of saying that liberals are politically to the left and that conservatives are to the political right. But that doesn't tell us what liberals and conservatives really believe. We'll answer that in the next several lessons. Learning what it means to be a liberal isn't as simple as it might seem. That's because the meaning of liberalism has changed over time. Let's begin to understand that by learning what it was to be a liberal 200 years ago. Because the meaning of being a liberal has changed, we'll refer to the liberalism of 200 years ago as classical liberalism. Some important thinkers from 200 years ago were called liberals because their great concern was the promotion of personal liberty. They wanted to figure out how to make us more free. For the radicals in France, this meant getting rid of their king. As we explore the ideas of these liberal philosophers, we'll identify three fundamental beliefs held by classical liberals. We will call these tenets of classical liberalism. One of the liberal philosophers from whom we derive the tenets of classical liberalism was a man named Adam Smith. Adam Smith is often referred to as the father of economics because he helped begin the systematic study of the production, exchange, and consumption of resources. Adam Smith's ideas had huge political consequences. Before Adam Smith, if someone were to ask whether a country was rich, they were likely asking about how much gold was in the king's treasury. In his book, Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith said that was wrong. Instead, he argued, we should look to how many goods and services were being produced by the people of the kingdom. This is a paradigm shift that leads one to look at the actions of the government differently. Taxes are an example of the difference. If you're just worried about how much gold the king has, you'll probably want taxes to be high. If you instead want to help the people be more productive, you will want to keep the taxes low. Adam Smith argued that the people would be most productive and the country most prosperous if they were left alone to decide for themselves what they would do with their own property and their own labor. He believed they could best choose for themselves what to make, how much they would sell it for, what they would buy, and how much they would pay, rather than the government trying to make any of those decisions for them. We then can derive a general principle from Adam Smith that goes beyond economic decisions, a principle that was held in common by classical liberal philosophers. Common people are rational beings. They are capable of making logical and wise decisions for themselves, and they should have the liberty to do so. They don't need the government to make decisions for them. For our next general principle, we will return to John Locke, who we met earlier in this course. Locke was also greatly concerned with increasing individual liberty. When we previously discussed Locke, it was as we learned about why we have government. Remember, Locke asked us to imagine a world without government. which he called the state of nature. Locke explained that the dangers of the state of nature would lead us to create a government to provide us with security, to save us from murderers and bandits. Specifically, we would want that government to protect our lives, our liberties, and our property. For Locke, the most important of these was the protection of property. Since property is not part of who we are, like our lives and our liberty, we have to leave it somewhere, and that puts it constantly under threat of being stolen. Locke supposed that conflicts over property would be the main source of trouble in the state of nature. The desire to protect their stuff would therefore drive people to quit the state of nature and form a society and government. And with that motivation, a classical liberal would believe that governments are created for the purpose of just making sure that no one takes stuff from us, including taking our lives, taking our liberty, and taking our property. From John Locke, we then derive our second belief shared by all classical liberals. Government exists to protect our lives, our liberty, and our property. This brings us to our next point, which is embodied in this quote that is attributed to Thomas Jefferson, though we don't know when or where he may have actually said it. If you are a classical liberal who believes that government exists to protect basic rights, you will then not want that government to build football stadiums, regulate marijuana use, or pay off student loans. Why? Well, if your primary goal is to have the government protect your life, liberty, and property, then you don't want that government taking those things away from you either. And the government would have to take away both liberty and property from people in order to do those sorts of things. We now have our third tenet of classical liberalism, that the powers of government are limited to only doing the very basic purposes that are assigned to it, to protect our lives, protect our liberties, and protect our property, and nothing more. So, if the government properly does its assigned duty of protecting us from those who would otherwise threaten us, who then remains as our greatest potential enemy? For the classical liberal, it is the government itself. It's constantly tempted to overstep its powers and go beyond its assigned duties, and that most threatens the liberties of its own citizens. It is our government, with its army and police force, its rules and regulations, its taxes and fines, that poses the greatest danger to our freedom. That completes this lesson. Now let's review what we learned. Adam Smith argued that who should control economic decisions? Should a monarch make economic decisions for everyone? Or should university professors make those decisions? Should an elected Congress do so? Or should individual people make their own economic choices? Adam Smith believed that individual people were best capable of making their own economic choices. Why do governments exist, according to John Locke? Do governments exist to make people equal? Or do they exist to serve the needs of a royal family? Do governments exist to protect private property? Or do they exist to promote traditional values? For Locke, governments exist primarily to protect private property, which was the thing most threatened in the state of nature. Which of the following is not a tenet of classical liberalism? Is it that people are capable of making their own decisions, or that taxes should be high? Is it that government protects people's rights, or is it that government power is limited? Having high taxes, which would require taking property from people, is not a tenet of classical liberalism. For a classical liberal, who is the greatest threat to personal liberty? Are thieves the greatest threat? Or are slavers? Are killers the greatest threat? Or is it the government? For a classical liberal, the government itself is the greatest threat to personal liberty. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 1. it'll be lesson 12, about conservatism.